It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. My name is Sansia Dali, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Investor Engagement at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Welcome to our quarterly investor dialogue on race and economic inequality, a year from George Floyd. It's truly a privilege to be hosting this conversation, particularly today, given the moment that we're in 1 year from the murder of George Floyd. And I'm delighted that we have a fantastic group of leaders from the investment sector joining us today to have a frank conversation around these topics and issues. But before we dive in, I would love if everyone could just take a moment to reflect, a minute of silence as we honor and recognize the spirit of George Floyd and what his passing has initiated within our society and certainly around the world, and those we have lost to racial violence and police brutality, particularly in the past year. So please join me in a moment of reflection. Thank you. As I mentioned, today we are joined by a group of leaders who have been using their influence and capital and knowledge to drive change within the industry. And so we're going to have a good conversation with our speakers, with whom I'd like to introduce right now, Stephanie Cohn-Rupp, who's a partner and CEO, who's the partner and CEO of Veris Wealth Partners, Olivia Knight, Racial Justice Initiative Manager at As You Sow, John Oxtoby, Senior Vice President and Director of ESG Investing at Ariel Investments, Mansco Perry III, the Executive Director and Chief Investment Officer at Minnesota State Board of Investments, and Christine Shaw, who is the Assistant Treasurer for Corporate Governance and Sustainable Investments at the Office of the State Treasurer in the Connecticut Retirement Plan and Trust Funds. Welcome, speakers. So great to have you with us at our investor dialogue this morning. We have a lot of ground that we're going to be covering. Anchored in a couple of themes, we're going to look at sort of what the macro context of sort of race and economic equality or inequality poses for the investment sector. We want to highlight some of the current actions that we've been hearing from investors, hear some of what you are doing, certainly what investors and corporations have been doing in this space, and then talk a little bit about what we expect to see in the future, both short term and long term, what you all are planning for within the context of the work you do going forward. But before I turn over to that, I think it's important for us to set some context here. What are the environment in which we're operating in? You know, so I want to share a couple of data points that I think really helps to contextualize some of what we're going to be talking about today. The first is around the wealth gap. The Federal Reserve Bank at St. Louis found that between 1992 and 2016, college-educated whites saw their wealth increase by 96%, while college-educated Blacks saw theirs fall by 10%. And this has not changed even today. The net worth of a typical white family is estimated at $171,000. It is 10 times that of a Black family at $17,000 and $17,150 per the Brookings Institute. And that data is as of 2016. 44% of Black families own their homes in comparison to 73.7% of white households. Citigroup in 2020, through a study, found that the US economy lost $16 trillion over the past 20 years because of discriminatory policies surrounding Black wages, education, housing, and investment. So this is the context in which we're having this conversation today, in light of what folks have estimated. I think it was Bloomberg estimated that close to $50 billion in corporate commitments have been made since May 2020 and counting. So we want to talk about what these numbers mean, your role as leaders touching on different aspects of the investment and corporate sector. So with that, I want to just throw out a question. Why do you think this past summer and the protests of this summer was a wake-up call for the investment and corporate community after decades of silence? And maybe I'll toss that question over to you, Mansko. What's your thought there? Why all of us? Why now? Remember to take yourself off mute.
Good morning. I guess I bring some historical perspective to this. I'm a kid of the 60s, and I think I mentioned to you, Santia, that I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and shortly after the beginning of the civil rights movement in 1967, there was a lot of destruction in this country. In Newark, there was a gentleman by the name of John Smith, who was a cab driver who was stopped by a couple of white policemen, and that set off 4 days that I saw my city torn to bits. Mm-hmm. Shortly after that, there were 10 days of complete destruction in Detroit, and also in Minneapolis and several other places around the country. And this was after Watts had taken place several years before. At that point in time, we did see some movement. I'd say that I'm a beneficiary of that. You had some corporations and organizations like the Ford Foundation make a movement to begin to get more kids of color into colleges around the country. And that went on through the rest of the 60s and into the 70s, and started to fade in the late 70s when a court case, the University of California Regents versus Bakke came along, and the Supreme Court had to rule on whether or not quotas could continue to be allowed for places for minority students. It was an interesting decision. They decided there couldn't be quotas, but they did point out that affirmative action was pretty good. Unfortunately, after that, we hit the Reagan era, and I'm one who believes that that's when things began to stall significantly. After there was a lot more focus on what I'd say is building one's wealth. Unfortunately, those of us with color, a few were able to participate, most were not. And I'd say that was a stalling point until after, in the early 90s, 1991, we had the episode with Rodney King, and again, there was a little bit more thought about what should be done. Then we did have the Clinton era. There were some positive steps taken there, but at the end of his term, there was things that were forestalled, and everyone got excited when Obama was elected, but we'd come off the great financial crisis, and uh, things weren't as prosperous as we hoped to be, and we need not mention what's happened the last 4 years. So when after George Floyd's unfortunate episode a year ago, we've seen a lot more commitments. What people don't realize is some of these commitments actually began before that. The Business Roundtable made a statement in 2019 where they said that they needed to have a broader focus than that of stakeholders. And I believe that that's when people began to think a bit more that things had to change. I think a lot of that was pushed by shareholders like many of ourselves, kind of pointing out that we all got on the ESG bandwagon, attending, much of that was focused on environmental, but and governance. But with organizations like RFK Human Rights, there at least was one beacon of light to deal on social issues. I think that they began to get the message. I still look at it and say it's good that we've got the commitments, but will it have the sustainability that I haven't seen in my 50 years of following episodes like these? I feel optimistic. I think one of the things that did help was that when you had protesting this time, it wasn't just people of color protesting, but you saw that there were a lot of Caucasian faces out protesting as well. So I'm a bit more optimistic, but I still think that the challenge is, will we see any solidarity there and progress made? But I think I've taken up too much of our time, so.
No, I think that's really helpful context, Mansko, and I think you touch on the point is, some of this might not have been just an overnight thing, but for many, it feels that way. And a number of us in the space are keeping a keen eye on this. So I want to turn things quickly to Olivia at As You Sow. You all have been tracking some of these commitments and what these commitments mean, where these commitments are being allocated, so to speak, from a sector standpoint. Tell us what you're seeing through your racial justice tracker As You Sow, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you. So our racial justice scorecards track the corporate progress of the S&P 500 on racial justice, looking at their initial statement made just after George Floyd's murder, and then expanding into their corporate policies and practices. So as of March, the last time we released this data set, our top scores overall were Alphabet at 61 and Intel at 56. But there was a significant portion of the S&P 500 that scored zeros across all of our KPIs on the scorecards. So of the S&P 500, we saw 36% of companies giving financial donations to racial justice causes. Some contributed as much as 5% of their market cap, but we're not tracking the detailed progress on these financial donations, although there have been recent reports that 250 million have actually been spent or committed to specific initiatives, but that still leaves a lot of money in the pot unaccounted for. Yeah. So when we started looking at these, we noticed that there was long-term commitments over the span of, some go up to 10 years. And so we really have to keep an eye on what these companies are doing with that money, what they're doing with these promises and community engagement, because if there are no watchdogs, then they don't have to be held accountable for their actions.